how the enemy attacks a lot of believers is that he will allow you to study the Bible, but he will make you read certain verses and understand it that even though it will not be incorrect, it will be incomplete. And an incomplete picture will produce an incomplete faith. John was the only disciple not to die by martyrdom. He was the only disciple to die a natural death. And so John, after this encounter with Jesus, and so you can imagine after they began to follow Jesus, John walked with Jesus for another 3.5 years. John was part of Jesus's inner circle because Jesus had 12 disciples. He had more, but he had 3 that were part of his inner circle. John witnessed Jairus' daughter being raised from the dead because Jesus only went with Peter, James, and John. John was part of the 3 who went to see Jesus being transfigured on the mount. John was also nicknamed the Son of Thunder, which means that he had a short fuse. They had an anger problem. I would call it misdirected zeal and passion. They were passionate, but it was misdirected. John was also ambitious. He was always asking who is going to be the greatest. And when Jesus was on the cross, Jesus entrusted his mother to John. What would make John go from being called the Son of Thunder to all of a sudden Jesus trusting him with his mother? And so after Jesus' death, John worked with Peter. And we're going to get to that in the book of Acts. John was the only disciple who would write more letters compared to the others. Paul wrote 2/3 of the New Testament, but John wrote 5 books. He wrote the Gospel of John, he wrote 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, and the book of Revelation. John was the only disciple not to die by martyrdom. He was the only disciple to die a natural death. John was exiled to the island of Patmos, which is where he got the revelation of the book of Revelation. And so the Gospel of John is the last gospel account to be written, which means that he must have read Matthew's account, Mark's account, Luke's account, and he noticed the similarities between them. There was nothing to update in what they had written because they are synoptic gospels, but he noticed that something was missing. In Matthew's genealogy, Matthew starts off his book by showing Jesus was the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Matthew is giving us the linkage. He's showing us how Jesus descended from Abraham through David. When he reads Mark tells us that he's the son of God, but doesn't really go into much detail. When we get to the book of Luke gives us another genealogy that takes him all the way to Adam. And I believe John has seen a major gap that we are all seeing how Jesus descended from heaven, from God. But he's like, it's one thing to believe that Jesus descended from God like a normal human being. We can all, if someone was to do our genealogy, we are all linked back to God because we all came from him. But John was like, nah, you guys are, you're missing one very important part, that he didn't just descend from God, he was God. Because I'm sure a lot of people were beginning to deny the deity of Jesus. Like, how can a human being be like, doesn't make sense. He's like, he didn't just descend from God. He was God. He was God in the flesh. When I was studying this, I felt like the Holy Spirit gave me a verse. It's like John probably meditated on this question that Jesus asked the Pharisees in Luke chapter 20, Luke 20:44. You guys remember this. Jesus 41, Jesus said to them, why is it said that the Messiah is the son of David? David himself declares in the book of Psalms, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for my feet. David calls him Lord. How then can he be his son? I'm sure John would have heard this question and is like, is it possible that he meditated on this question long enough? And at some point, John went from seeing Jesus as the Son of God to seeing Jesus as God. And so I believe John was inspired to write this letter to prove that Jesus was not just the Messiah. He was the Messiah, but not just the Messiah. He was the Son of God, but not just the Son of God. He was God in the flesh. And he's writing because there's a difference in your faith when you believe that Jesus was God. Hebrews 11 verse 6 says, this is the anatomy of faith. Again, how the enemy attacks a lot of believers is that he will allow you to study the Bible, but he will make you read certain verses and understand it that even though it will not be incorrect, it will be incomplete. And an incomplete picture will produce an incomplete faith. So there's a very popular verse in Hebrews 11. Without faith, it is impossible to please God. I'd heard that growing up, and I thought that was all the verse said until I began to, and this is why it's important for you to read the Bible yourself. Because all of a sudden when I'm reading, I'm like, hold on, there's a comma there? Like, that's not the entire verse. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists. So whoever wrote the book of Hebrews is giving us the anatomy of faith, that the kind of faith that pleases God is, number one, when you come to him, you must first believe that he exists. And number two, and that he rewards those who earnestly seek seeking. When I'd become a Christian, these were the two questions I had to ask, and this is what deepened my faith, because I had to ask myself the question, do I believe that God truly exists? You can believe in the gospel, but not believe that God exists, but not believe that God is faithful, because that's what that second part says, that he rewards those who earnestly or diligently seek him. And so I believe by reading the book of John, it is going to complete your faith, because by believing these two things, it will deepen your trust. By believing that Jesus was God, it will build a different level of conviction in the words that he spoke. So now we'll understand why John starts his gospel this way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. In order for John to prove that Jesus was God, he also needed to establish his origin. So he didn't say Jesus came from a human being. He says in the beginning of time, the Word already existed. The Word was with God. The Word was God. When I was studying this, I'm like, well, how did John know this? John had interacted with the physical manifestation of Jesus. He had walked with him for 3.5 years. He had seen him do amazing things. But at some point, because he saw Jesus's body pass away, but he noticed that there was something in Jesus that did not pass away. He recognized that the words Jesus was speaking was eternal. They saw his body die. Even though he resurrected, they saw it pass away and come back. But the words that he spoke didn't pass. It was eternal. And so at some point, John deciphered that this man, how did he get these things? How did he know these words? How did he saw the essence of Jesus. You can imagine him meditating on the miracles, like Jesus was manifesting what was written. He told us that he would be killed and raised on the third day, and that all who believe in him would have the same life. How could he have known that? He probably remembered when Jesus would say, I and my Father are one. John saw beyond the flesh and realized that Jesus was the source code. You know, it's interesting. When a few days ago I was at a conference, and I work at a company that is into data analytics. We analyze data. And as one person was presenting, it suddenly clicked. When it says in the beginning was the Word, change that word for in the beginning was data. Think about that. Because the word is information. In the beginning was data. When you are coding a website, in the beginning of that website was a source code, was data. In the beginning of any business is data. And so John is also saying that he wasn't just created, he was co-creator, because he was with God. And the Word was God. And I've said it here before, if you want to have a conversation with God, read his word, because the Word was God. Study the life of Jesus. Listen to what Jesus said. You are going to be interacting with God through the Word. And so in verse 1, in the beginning of time was the Logos. The root meaning of that word is Logos. What does Logos mean? Logos means what has already been said, what has already been written. Past tense. So in the beginning, things were already established. In the beginning was the word that was already written. In the beginning was the data that was already established. What is the thing that is already established but cannot change? The law. So we can say in the beginning was the law, which is why Jesus said, heaven and earth can pass away, but my words, the law, cannot pass. Because before time came, the law already existed. And when you look at that word God, it says the word was God. The root meaning of that word God means supreme divinity. Another word is magistrate. What is a magistrate? Someone who administrates the law. And so verse 3 says, through him all things were made. Through the source code, the website was made. Think about it from that. Let's make it relatable. Through him all things were made. Everything we can see were made through the source code. And so you can imagine him being the Word. If the website looks wrong, you can't change the website without changing the source code. And so when Jesus, the Word, created the entire world, when the Word created the world, interesting, he created it perfect. But there was something that he did. He also created free-willed beings. He created entities who had the power of choice. They had the power to choose if the website will remain like this or if they would want to change it. So you can imagine when the Word finally came into the world that he created, he's walking around as the source code, seeing corruption being manifested, seeing viruses being manifested in his creation. And he knew how to correct the bugs, which is what healing is. Healing is literally restoring the code back to what was written, which is why we need forgiveness. Now it says, verse 4, in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. In him was life. Remember, in the beginning, God, the Lord God, breathed into man the breath of life. So even the atheists who say there is no God are using the breath of God. They are saying there's no God by saying there's God. And so that breath is what makes us conscious. Is what gives us the animation. Is what makes us able to move. It's what makes us think. And it says that in him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. So guess when your light shines? It is when the life that you're living aligns with the Word. light shines. When your life lines up with the Logos, it produces light. When it doesn't, it produces darkness. In him was life, and that light was the light of all mankind. When Jesus' life produced light, when he was baptized in the Jordan by John the Baptist, and then after he was tempted in the wilderness, he came to the temple and found where it was written, when your life aligns with the Logos, your light shines. And so in verse 6, it says, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, the way John is writing this letter, he is assuming that you already know who he's talking about. In the other books, they are specifying John the Baptist. But John, again, this is the last letter to be written. So he's assuming, possibly writing to the church, assuming that you guys already know who I'm talking about. Because I don't know why he didn't put John the Baptist. There was a man sent from God whose name was John, and he came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. Now, I'm going to show you guys something, because when I read this chapter, it made me empathize with the Pharisees. It says, the true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world, and he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. Imagine that. And he came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision or a husband's will, but born of God. And so the word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. The word became flesh. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. He didn't just come full of grace, he came full of grace and truth. There's a balance. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this clip and you want to know how to hear from God using the Bible, I'd love to invite you to a live Bible study session that is happening every single day, Monday to Friday, 5 to 6 p.m. EST, where I show you how to not just read the Bible for information, but how to meditate on it for revelation, because revelation is the key to your transformation. Take care. Bye-bye.